Hello and welcome to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was Leah Warriner-Wood, who was talking to me about the Delaval tapestries that she had the opportunity to work on while she was a student, and it has become one of her obsessions. So enjoy as we both talk about conservation and what it's like to conserve these wonderful tapestries. Why do you want to talk about this tapestry?
It's kind of become my obsession, in the nicest possible way. I'll start at the beginning. So the tapestries that I'm going to talk about are at a place called Doddington Hall, which is just about 4 or 5 miles outside of Lincoln in the East Midlands, and that's where I live. And I have lived in Lincoln my whole life, so I've always been aware of Doddington, but I was really lucky that in I think 2010 I was part of a group of conservation students from the University of Lincoln who were invited to come along and take part in a project to conserve the tapestries at Doddington Hall, and I really enjoyed that project. And I thought, gosh, there's got to be a story to tell here. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yes, there is a story to tell here. And to cut a long story short, this ultimately became my PhD, which I started again with the University of Lincoln in 2015. And I'm just about coming to the end of that now, hoping to complete that this year. There's been a pandemic in the middle, which is unusual.
Was it a part-time PhD then?
It is a part-time PhD, yes, yeah, and I work at the university as well as a lecturer, so I'm blending the study with teaching as well. But the tapestries really became, like I say, a bit of an obsession for me after that 2010 first involvement, really.
There's not wrong with that. It's always good to have an obsession about stuff.
Especially if it's history related.
Oh yeah. There's just so many wonderful things about history, and there's so many things, like, to use a very cheesy term about the tapestry sort of thing, is like there's lots of threads that weave into the history of, well, history and why things all connect and stuff, and so it's kind of cool. So what is it that you do? So you conserve this tapestry?
So yeah, we were as a group of students, we were involved in the first stages of the conservation of these tapestries. So there are actually 2 tapestry rooms at Doddington Hall. One's called the Holly Bedroom and one's called the Yellow Bedroom. And we were invited to come and conserve the tapestries in the Holly Bedroom, which are from the 17th century, and they show scenes of rural life. So there's a couple having a couple courting in the woods. There's a cobbler. There's an itinerant merchant with his pack of wares on his back. There's a musician and a dog dancing along to his bagpipes. So when you step into the room, you get this real sense of you're sort of stepping into a glade in a forest or something, and all of these characters are going about their day-to-day business around you. But by 2010, the tapestries had been hanging on the wall for quite some time, several hundred years, and they were in quite a bad. And Doddington Hall had been very fortunate, and they had been awarded some Heritage Lottery funding to conserve them, and also to involve the community in this conservation work. And one of the communities that they sought to involve was the University of Lincoln. So we went along as a group of students, and we worked with the National Trust's Chief Textile Advisor at the time, a lady called Ksenia Marco. Ksenia is still very active in textile conservation, but has technically retired. But we worked with Ksenia, and we examined the tapestries, we took measurements, we took a lot of photographs. We applied our conservation training to work out how they deteriorated and how poorly they had deteriorated. And then we took them down from the walls, and we vacuumed them, and we recorded them again when they were flat, because they look flat on the floor, so when they're hanging on the wall, and you can see more and you can see the back, and so on. And then we rolled them back up, and they were shipped off to a facility that specialises in cleaning tapestries and restoring tapestries, as well as weaving new tapestries, the DeWitt facility in Belgium. And then Doddington Hall started raising money again to allow their full conservation, because they needed more than just cleaning. And by that time, I had this very obsession, and I carried on being involved in a voluntary way in the project to actually stitch the tapestries to get them stabilised to be put back on, whilst I was working on my PhD.
That's really cool, actually. Yeah, no, I think it's one of those things where people know about conservation, but they also don't know about conservation. Like, they think it's this really cool thing, but don't fully know the true ins and outs. And I think it's just getting sad to the point where now, to be a conservator, it's getting harder and harder to even get a decent job in that field, because the most that most museums can afford nowadays is just like preventative conservation, which is checking out like bugs and lighting and stuff, which is all useful stuff. It's all valid stuff, but it's good for people to be able to go more in depth regards to like looking into that tapestry and stuff, because I'm sure you're probably to do more things than just pest control on that tapestry.
Yeah, so the main issues that there were with the tapestries when we examined them for the first time was there was obviously a lot of light fading. So light fading is completely irreversible. There isn't anything that you can do about that. But there was also a lot of soiling on the surface. There was a lot of surface dirt and dirt that had worked its way into the fibres. So, you know, over hundreds of years, the action of burning coal fires or wood fires had created a lot of particulate dirt in the rooms that had settled on the tapestries, but also just day-to-day living. We all know our houses get dusty if we don't dust and vacuum them regularly. Well, you know, they didn't have vacuum cleaners then, so they couldn't go vacuuming their tapestries on the walls, and so they'd accumulate the usual dust and debris and what have you that occurs in all of our houses, whether they're large country houses or small suburban homes. So there was light damage, there was dirt and soiling. There was also damage from use. So the tapestries in the Holly bedroom literally were wall to wall, floor to ceiling. They covered everything. They even covered the doors.
Wow.
And so when the door had been opened and closed for centuries, that had obviously put stress on the tapestry. But people in the 17th and 18th centuries weren't so different to ourselves. They didn't always use the door handle to close the door. They just sort of would push it behind them. And so just centuries of the tapestries being touched, the transfer of the grease and the oils from skin had transferred onto them. The abrasion from them being touched regularly had deteriorated them. So there was quite a lot of loss of the wool that makes up the picture. And so they were quite poorly by the time we found them in 2010, and there was some pest damage as well. We did find, for example, evidence that moths had been present, and the baby moths, the moth larvae, had eaten some of the tapestries, because wool and silk are both protein fibres, and small mini beasts need protein just as much as we do in our diets, so they'd munched away on those proteinaceous fibres.
Yeah, I think like moths and stuff is a big thing in like most museums. There's moths and like carpet beetles and things like that are quite like a big issue in a lot of museums. So what's the history behind the actual tapestries? Who did these tapestries belong to?
So this is kind of one of the things that I've been researching in my thesis, because there's not an awful lot known about these tapestries. At Doddington, they're most closely related with John Delaval that you mentioned John Delaval owned Doddington from, I'm just going to say 1759, but it's a bit more complicated than that, but from 1759 until I think 1808. But the tapestries predate him by a good 100, 120, 130 years. And there is evidence in the tapestries themselves that they were hung in a different configuration in the room to the Delaval had them hung in the 18th century. And that was one of the things that really interested me. So where were they? Which rooms were they in? What did they look like when they were hanging before? So through my research, I've been able to dig into that a little bit, and I found a few inventories and things like that that have helped me to figure out that the tapestries were definitely at Doddington in 1724. Which doesn't take us back much further. But from that and a bunch of other stuff, I've been able to, I hope, figure out that they probably came to Doddington in the 17th century. So I think actually in the 1660s. And there's a really fun story behind that, involving the Civil War, which sounds not fun, but yeah, bear with me. So Doddington Hall was built in around about 1600, and it was built for a guy called Thomas Taylor, who was the registrar to the Bishop of Lincoln. And he had this country house built, and then it passed to the Hussey family by the middle of the 1600s. During the Civil War, the Hussey family supported the king. They were royalists. Okay. That obviously did not go down too well when Oliver Cromwell had Charles I's head lopped off, and we parliamentary country. So the Hussey family, they managed to hang on to Doddington, which was kind of a win, actually. Yeah. But they managed to hold on to Doddington, but they were fined by Oliver Cromwell's Parliament. They got a great big fat fine for, and I quote, their delinquency in supporting the king. So this went back and forth with them saying, well, this isn't very fair. You've given us this fine, and it was a bit like, well, yeah, we've given you this fine, but you've been able to keep your house, so just pay the fine. So they had to pay off this fine, which was not insignificant even for a family that could afford to live in Doddington Hall. Anyway, skipping to the end of this period, and with the restoration of King Charles II, the family who had supported King Charles I loyally suddenly were in the head honcho's good graces again. So the Hussey family started to be more prosperous again, and they started to really rise in society again. So the head of the Hussey family at the time was made Sheriff of Lincolnshire and was an MP, and
blimey,
and they prosper again. And he got married. He got married in the 1660s, around the same time that Charles II was restored to the throne. And it's my belief that the tapestries date from the time of his marriage, and that they were bought as a sign of the family's newly found or newly rediscovered prosperity, and as a sign of Mr. Hussey's marriage.
Is there any, so the imagery in the tapestries, what kind of period do they date to, the imagery?
So they, it's contemporary with the time in which they were woven. So the fashions in the tapestries in the Holly bedroom in particular would have been contemporary fashions at the time that they were woven, because they depict scenes of rural life. There's quite a lot of sort of ordinary clothing depicted in the tapestries, which, as you know, can be hard to date compared to high status clothing. But the largest tapestry in the Holly bedroom is, we called it during conservation, the courting couple tapestry, and it depicts a man and a lady in the woods. And there's a peacock next to them, and it's all very lovely. And the man has taken his hat off, and it's a plumed feathered hat, and he's bowing to the lady in front of him. She's wearing a very nice dress that's woven in silk threads, and the back of the tapestry showed that was a lovely sort of pink colour, not as bright as Barbie pink, but it was a nice soft pink colour in her dress. And the style of the dress, if you compare it to existing examples of moderate to high status dress, dates from around the time that the tapestries were woven. And the stance of the couple is actually really interesting, because it is taken from, or it appears to be taken from, an engraving of a man at court paying homage to the Queen. And he is bending over and taking off his hat, doffing his hat to the Queen, who's standing in front of him in a very, very similar dress to the one the lady's wearing in the tapestry. So it seems as though the tapestry weavers took this design from print culture, and they turned it into a design that could be woven into the tapestry in this set of scenes of rural life, which these scenes, these themes of pastoral life were quite popular at the time as well. But that was a really, really exciting find to see this same, what we called the courting couple, to find out that they were actually based on a queen and a courtier.
That's really cool, actually. Just the fact that you said that it's all everyday life as well, that's kind of piqued my interest as well. The representation of just the everyday folk. So my background, for example, is in archaeology, and that focuses on the everyday folk, whereas history focuses on the winners, the kings and queens and stuff. And I like that the tapestry is depicting everyday life, because it's not something that we tend to know much about. So what other kind of scenes does it portray as well? So that was in the is this the yellow tapestry? Did you say this is
the holly bedroom?
Yeah, Holly bedroom. And yeah. What's the other tapestry like?
The tapestries in the yellow bedroom are really quite different, and they depict scenes from the Trojan Wars. The Trojan Wars was also a very popular thing to have in your tapestries. There are some very famous sets of tapestries depicting the Trojan Wars, for example, from the Vatican and from royal palaces around Europe. So in the yellow bedroom, we've got quite a different theme going on. We've got a scene which is actually behind me in my imaginary background, but your listeners obviously won't be able to see that. But just to describe that scene that's going on, we've got a tapestry that on one side has a lady who's sitting in again a countryside environment, and she's surrounded by some attendants, and this lady and her attendants are all looking towards the other half of the tapestry and into the distance, because on the other half of the tapestry, coming towards this group of figures, is the Trojan horse. And we've got this very it looks very muscular actually when it's woven, just by how the process of weaving depicts what's going on. So it looks like quite a muscular horse.
Yeah, it also looks like it's got some like scales on it or something.
Yeah, its flanks do look like it's quite scaly. I like to think that perhaps it's abs. Equine abs. I don't know enough about equine anatomy to suggest what it is, but it's got a very lovely, very rich looking mane and tail as well. There's quite a lot of time gone into weaving this Trojan horse, and he's on a platform which is being pushed presumably towards the city of Troy, which is not depicted in the tapestry, so which is in the distance. But my theory is that the lady and the group around her are supposed to represent Helen of Troy and her attendants. So you've got scenes like that where you have two of the key figures in the stories of the history of Troy. But you've also got scenes that are harder to identify. So there's a scene where there's a boat being landed on the side of a river, or on the bank of a lake, or something like that. And there's men in armor with weapons jumping out of this boat as if they're going to head straight into battle. And there's a few different types, a few different stories from the history of Troy that could be assigned to. And that meaning, that narrative for the tapestry has kind of got lost over the years, and we can only assume that when the tapestries were first bought and hung in the mid 17th century, that the people seeing them would have been a bit more familiar, perhaps, with this, and would have recognised that. There's also another great tapestry in the Yellow Bedroom, which depicts the court of King Lycomedes at Skyros. And it's one of the quite famous scenes where oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the character. This is awful. Anyway, one of the key figures in the Trojan Wars, your listeners no doubt will be shouting now, it's this person. But anyway, one of the key characters in the Trojan Wars was hidden at the court of Lycomedes at Skyros to protect him from his death, which had been prophesied to happen in the Trojan Wars. And he was hidden at Skyros disguised as a woman. But in order to trick him to take part in the wars, somebody else comes along, and they are is disguised as a peddler, and he's supposedly bringing jewelry and beautiful things for Lycomedes' daughters to buy, but he also happens to have some weapons, and unfortunately this disguised chap, whose name will probably come to me at some point, Achilles. There we go, Achilles.
So for those who watch the film, I think that's Brad Pitt's character, I think, if they watch the film.
I have not seen the film, otherwise maybe I should have done that, might have helped. But Achilles, who's been disguised as a woman and hidden at Skyros, really takes a fancy to this sword and picks it up and starts waving it around, and oh my goodness, he is uncovered as being not a girl after all. And that is the moment that the tapestry depicts. So this group are sitting by Lycomedes on his throne with a crown on, so that we know that he's the king, and there's Odysseus there disguised as a merchant, and then we have a rather spectacular Achilles with a rather spectacular beard, standing on the other side of the throne with a sword, demonstrating this point where he's just been found out, and ends up going to fight in the wars after all, and that's a really nice moment. But one of the really fascinating things about the tapestries is that we were only initially able to see half of that story, because that tapestry had been cut in half, and it had been cut right through Achilles, and so you really only saw the bottom half of Achilles' gown. You certainly didn't see the beard. And so when we first saw the tapestry, we assumed that it was the court of a king, perhaps, or something fancy going on, with a gentleman in long robes and with a lady in a very fancy brocaded dress. And it was only when the tapestry was taken down from the walls for conservation that one of the owners at Doddington Hall said, "Oh, I think we've got a piece in our stores that matches up with that." And they went and fetched it out, and we were able to align the weaving with the piece that had come down from the wall, and the piece that they'd rescued, that they'd brought out of the store, had King Lycomedes on his throne and had the rest of the bearded and gowned Achilles, and that allowed us to pinpoint what narrative this was telling from this history of Troy. So that was an absolutely fantastic day, and that's really one of the highlights of the project for me, was discovering that this wasn't a beautifully dressed lady in an ornate dress. This was actually a chap with a beard that a modern gentleman would be proud of.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool, actually. So are you able to find out whereabouts the tapestry is from? So is it definitely been made in Britain, or does it seem to have like been maybe brought over from like France or Italy or something? Would you be able to tell that?
Yeah, so they're from Europe. They were woven in Flanders, in the region that we would recognise as Flanders now. There are no records of the tapestries having been bought. So we don't, that's one of the reasons why we don't know exactly when they came to Doddington, and I've had to make an educated guess about that. But that also doesn't tell us about exactly where they came from. So it's very difficult to pinpoint them to a particular town in that region, but it was a very busy tapestry producing region. Tapestries which are more expensive and which are woven for the highest status homes and palaces and ecclesiastical palaces, they tend to have a signature of the weaver woven into them, or they'll perhaps have a small woven shield in the bottom border or something like that, and that allows you often to identify the town that they were manufactured in, and sometimes the individual manufactory as well. The tapestries at Doddington are more of an off the peg variety. So when I'm giving talks about this, I sometimes will say, okay, so these aren't your Harrods tapestries, but they're not your Lidl tapestries either. Obviously, other supermarkets are available. These are your middle of the range, perhaps maybe your Sainsbury's tapestries, maybe your Waitrose tapestries. So they're not the lowest quality. But they're not the highest quality either. And they certainly weren't woven to fit the rooms at Doddington. We know that by the way that they had to be cut to fit into the rooms. So the chances are that they were woven in one of the many manufacturers in Flanders that were that made an honest living out of producing these middling quality tapestries that were bought by people like the Hussey family, who weren't the highest status people in the country, but who had a country house and who could afford to decorate that reasonably richly. So they're from Europe, and they were imported into Britain. Britain didn't really have a thriving tapestry weaving industry at that time. Most of the tapestry was coming out of mainland Europe.
Oh, cool. And you said at least you got the rest of one little bit of the story left. Is there any other fragments that were found, or have they unfortunately gone?
No, Doddington is really fascinating actually, because since it was built in, like I said, around about 1600, it's never been sold and it's never been emptied. So it has this really brilliant unbroken line of family occupation right through from the very early 17th century to the present day. And that means that it's an absolute treasure trove for people like me. So I consider myself, although I'm a conservator, and that's what I lecture in, I consider myself also a material culture historian.
Okay.
I get excited about the stories that you can tell from stuff. From the stuff that we surround our lives with. That's what got me into history and heritage in the first place, was going around old houses and imagining all the people that lived in among this stuff. And Doddington is fascinating because it's crammed to the gills with stuff. And so, yes, we did find some other fragments of tapestry, and so did they in the 18th century, when John Delaval had the tapestries taken down from the walls, and he had them repaired and he had them altered to match his vision for Doddington Hall. And we know that, or we can tell that, because a lot of the tapestries are patched. So they were already over 100 years old by the time John Delaval came to re-engineer them, if you like. And he brought in a tailor, probably a local tailor from the Doddington or the Lincoln area. And he had a tailor mending the tapestries, and there must have been tapestry fragments in storage at the hall at that point, or they must have had access to tapestries from other rooms in the house, because the tapestries that remain at the hall today have had parts cut away from them, and then parts of other tapestries sewn in to those gaps. They've also got small pieces of tapestry that have been cut and stitched onto the back to fill a hole, and to reinforce a hole. So there must have been tapestry at Doddington still in the 18th century that they could use for this process. And for me and my teammates as conservators, that was so interesting, that there was this adaptive reuse of the tapestries firstly, but also there was this this drive to not reweave the tapestries, but to patch them with other bits of tapestry that they could get their hands on. It's quite a sort of make, do and mend approach, and today we would probably call it sustainable living.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Now, was it actually really good to see that, or was it also really frustrating to see that? Because I think I would be, if I was doing conservation, I'd be like kind of torn, because on one hand it'd be fascinating to see how they in a way conserved the items at that time period, but also because it's not to our standards anymore, I would just be like, but
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I did feel quite torn. I do feel quite torn about it, but I think mostly I was just absolutely drawn in by this idea of, why would you do that? So you've inherited this country house with these tapestries that, for a family who'd been fined only just before the restoration a huge amount of money, would have been quite a significant investment. So you've got these inherited beautiful tapestries, which must have had more colour in them then than they have now, because they were only, in inverted commas, 100 years old by that point. So you've inherited these tapestries in these rooms, but you've got a vision for your 18th century country house. And so you take them down from the walls, and you don't get a specialist up from London to do anything about it. You just get the local tailor, because they can sew, right?
Yeah.
So you get the local tailor in, and you get them to chop the tapestries up the middle and cut them around your fireplace, and cut bits out that have been damaged, and cut that border off the bottom that's been damaged, and cut that border off another tapestry, and just sew it on. So I was really drawn in by the just the question of why on earth would you do that? And that's what became my PhD thesis. But at the same time, with my conservation hat on, it was really frustrating that this had happened. It made it incredibly difficult to record the tapestries, because the tapestries, after they were conserved, they were going to be hung back on the walls, and we knew that, but we also knew that it would probably involve several years of fundraising for Doddington to be able to achieve that, because tapestry conservation is a very long and expensive process. So we had to record them very carefully, including, for example, where the seams were. And on some of the tapestries that had had extensive patching, there were many seams. And so tracking all of these alterations to the tapestries down was definitely a challenge for the recording process. And some of these seams only really became evident after we'd vacuumed the tapestries. So there were the drawings that we were making and the photographs that we were taking were constantly having to be added to. And that made it a very mentally challenging process, actually, to keep track of everything that was going on. All of the seamed parts and the joined in parts also made it quite tricky at some points during the stitched conservation of the tapestry. So after they'd been cleaned and when they were being sewn to a support to stabilize them for being hung back on the walls. Because where you have a piece of tapestry, for example, that's been added in, so a piece has been chopped away and then a new piece has been added in as a patch for that, you've sometimes got a double thickness of tapestry, and so that makes the process of supporting them through stitching a little bit more difficult. But also the people who had repaired them and altered them in around about 1762, they didn't really understand the material that they were working with. So they treated it like any other cloth. But a tapestry is a woven cloth. It has a warp yarn and it has a weft yarn. But in a tapestry, the warp yarns, which are the strongest yarn, they go across rather than up or down. Up and down is the strongest way, because those yarns are continuous, and so gravity doesn't act on them as strongly as it does on the discontinuous yarns. But in a tapestry, because they're usually longer than they are tall, they're woven with the warps going across and running horizontally. And you can see that in the pieces of the tapestries that were original and in good condition. But some of the patched pieces had been put in the wrong way around. They'd been attached, they'd been sewn in, or they'd been sewn on with the warp going up and down. Rather than across. So from that material evidence, it became obvious that the tailor, the people that were doing this, that were making these alterations, didn't completely understand how a tapestry was woven, and that also can make it challenging for conservation, because you have decisions about, well, if it's a patch applied to the back, do we leave it because it tells the 1762 story, or do we remove it because it's actually putting strain on the original weave to be in a different orientation? So there are some quite complicated conservation decisions that had to be made during the conservation process because of the way the tapestries had been treated by John Delaval's tailor.
It is really cool though. I genuinely love stuff like that. I love that things like that have stories, and it's just a shame that, yeah, of course nobody's going to think about the future. I think we probably do stuff that we don't think about what's going to happen to the future. But I suppose on one hand, it would be like, if I had that time machine, I'd go back in time, like, don't do it that way. I'm going to have to consider this.
Yeah, and I would absolutely ask John Delaval, what were you thinking? Because it would have saved me 10 years of part-time PhD study.
It might be something simple like, well, you know, I like the shaping, you know, goes around my fireplace, I like. Well, to have the money.
Yeah, I know. We just need Doctor Who, basically, to come along with the wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff,
yeah.
and zip us back to Doddington Hall in 1762 and just roll up to the holly and yellow bedrooms and go, so about these tapestries.
Yeah. Oh, well. Yeah. So yeah, this is really fascinating stuff. What more do you think you need to say about these tapestries? Because I think we could talk about this all day if we wanted to, because this is just really fascinating.
Oh, I absolutely could go on all day. I mean, you don't do 9.5, 10 years on something like this without accumulating an awful lot of stuff. What haven't I covered? I suppose listeners might be thinking, well, yeah, but why? Why was it? Why did John Delaval have this? Because I've posed this question several times now. Why on earth would you do that to your tapestries? So I suppose I could just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what my thesis has ended up being about. So although I'm a conservator, and although I became involved with the tapestries through actually conserving them, my thesis isn't actually about the conservation process. As fascinating as it is, and as much of a privilege as it was to be involved in it, the question of why John Delaval had this done to his tapestries became the one that I couldn't escape. And I love a puzzle, and I'm a bit like a dog with a bone when there's any sort of historical puzzles that need to be solved. But I also had my conservation hat on, and I thought, okay, so there isn't really much written down about these tapestries. There's a couple of entries in inventories, there's one letter, and there's a few entries in the accounts that talk about paying the tailor to mend the tapestries. And the letter is from the house steward at Doddington to John Delaval, and talks of having the tapestries hung in the chamber adjoining the best staircase. But that's it. In terms of written words about the tapestries, the actual words that refer to the tapestries number, I think, less than 150 in the whole Delaval archive. So with my conservation hat very firmly pulled down over my ears, I thought, can I tell this story through what I found out by actually conserving the tapestries? And that's the challenge that I took on. So blending these human stories that you can find out about by examining the tapestries, blending that with a bit of history and a bit of conservation. What could I find out about why John Delaval had the tapestries hung? And it seemed like climbing Mount Everest when I had this idea. And the chances were at the time that the answer to that question, what can I find out, was going to be, well, very little actually. But actually it turned out to be, well, rather a lot, as it happens. So my thesis has ended up being about John Delaval's expression of elite masculinity through his curation of the tapestry interiors at Doddington Hall. And this came about because the more I read about John Delaval, the more I realised that he was something of a social climber. So the Delaval family had been let's just call them a locally wealthy family in the northeast of England. Their main house is at Seaton Delaval, which is a National Trust property in the northeast, not too far from Berwick upon Tweed. That's where the family had their main seat, but they'd inherited Doddington Hall through the marriage of John Delaval's mother to Captain Delaval, his father. Rhoda, John Delaval's mother, had inherited Doddington Hall from her Hussey family. So she had her grandparents were the Husseys who I spoke about earlier. And so the Delavals were wealthy and they were influential in the northeast, but they weren't hugely influential in London. And John Delaval was the second son, so he was the spare. He had an older brother, Francis, who the family called Frank. And Frank might as well have been the muse for the Rake's Progress by Hogarth. because he was your stereotypical 18th century gent who spent too much time in London, too much time at the races, and spent too much money on gambling. So Frank Delaval got the family into rather a lot of trouble, and they actually had to remortgage their estates to pay off his debts. At which point, his younger brother John, who was rather more sensible, bailed him out basically and took over Frank's business affairs and sort of became de facto head of the family. John also became an MP for Berwick-upon-Tweed, and he gradually made his way up the social scale and became more influential in London. He made friends with royal dukes, and he kind of took the family out of this debt-ridden mire that his older brother had got them into, and he turned them into really quite a wealthy, high status in the southeast of the country family. And Doddington was the place he started that. It was the first house that was his. He inherited it from his mother, Rhoda, as the second son, and he inherited it in 1759 at a time when he's really starting to want to make his mark. He'd recently become an MP. He was starting to court people in high status circles and starting to make his way in the world. And after inheriting Doddington in 1759, from 1760 to 1762, he set about completely renovating it, and including having the tapestries altered. And then in 1761, he was ennobled. He was made a baronet. He became Sir John Hussey Delaval.
Go John.
Exactly. Go John. So he's making his way in the world. He's putting his stamp on the world. And what I'm arguing, what my research argues, is that he used Doddington Hall to do that as a place where he could entertain the right sort of people and show them that he was the right sort of person to have in their inner circle and the right sort of person to rely on. So around about this time, in the mid-18th century, to be an elite man, to be a successful elite man, you had to, this is simplifying it very much, but you had to pretty much have two things. You had to have inherited family. You had to be from a good family, and you had to have a number of independent characteristics yourself. So you had to have good taste. You had to have independent wealth, and you had to demonstrate these things, both of these things, family, inheritance, and independence. You had to demonstrate that, and John Delaval was demonstrating that through the way he decorated Doddington Hall. He had an inherited house in which, at the top of the best staircase, so at the top of the main route that visitors would take through his house, he had 2 rooms that were hung with inherited tapestries, which would have been old luxury goods from the 17. Also had a very modern for the time drawing room that was right next door to these tapestry rooms. So the drawing room was a very large room. It was decorated with flock wallpaper, with gilded girandole on the walls, with a very ornate fireplace. There was a harpsichord. There were paintings of the families all around the walls, and the inventories tell us this. They help us to imagine this drawing room. So the drawing room was basically equipped with all of the mod cons of the mid-18th century, with the fashionable stuff that you needed to demonstrate your independent wealth and your good taste. And the drawing room was right next to these two tapestry rooms that had this much more antiquarian feel about them, with the adaptively reused tapestries that he'd inherited with the house from his very old Hussey family, who you could date right back to the building of Doddington Hall. So to me, he's making a statement through the interior decoration of his house. He's making a statement that says, I am from an old family. I have inherited wealth. I'm from a group of a family who could afford to buy luxury like tapestries. But also, hey, head into my drawing room and come and spend an evening with me in my drawing room, because in there I'll show you the paintings that I've had commissioned of my family, to demonstrate that I'm taking my dynasty into the future, that I am the next big thing in the Delaval family, and I'm going to show you these paintings, and you can spend time listening to my wife and my daughters play on the harpsichord. We'll light the candles in front of the gilded mirrors, and we'll spend time here socializing right into the evening, because I'm, as well as being from an old family, I'm also a guy who knows how to live in the present and has the money to do it. And to me, that is why the tapestries at Doddington are so exciting, because they're not a standalone thing. As interesting as they are as a standalone thing, they're not only a standalone thing, they're a part of a much more intricate strategy that was aiming at expressing who John Delaval was to an audience of people that he wanted to impress, so that he could continue to climb this social ladder.
That's really wonderful. That's actually really cool. Yeah, no, it makes actual sense. It makes lots of sense. Like when you were talking about that, I was like, yeah, you're proving both sides. You're proving I'm a man of the modern world, but also, yes, I am part of the old world as well. So this is why I'm allowed to be here, effectively, sort of thing.
Absolutely. And he had to walk that line. And he did that. And he did that in part through the way that he decorated his house. And just to bring it back to the conservation is absolutely crucial, because we wouldn't have known any of this if it weren't for the tapestries being conserved with that funding support from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And I would never have found out any of this if I hadn't been a conservation student who was selected to get involved in this absolutely wonderful project. Because, as I said, there's nothing, or very, very, very little written that would have told us this story. It's all come from looking at how the tapestries have been displayed, how they've been cut up, how they've been patched, and working out how they were previously displayed, and so on.
That is amazing. So, are the tapestries back on the walls? Are people actually able to go and see these tapestries?
Yes, they are. Yes, the tapestries are back on the walls now in both the holly and the yellow bedrooms. The drawing room at Doddington is also presented in very much a way that would have been familiar to John Delaval in the 18th century. John Delaval's Doddington is still a privately owned family house, but it's a member of the Historic Houses Association, I believe, and it is partially open to the public. They have a website. It'll be available on Google. Am I allowed to mention the website address?
Yeah.
So it's just www.doddingtonhall.com, and anybody who's listening can go along and take a look for themselves. The tapestry rooms and the drawing room are on the first floor, so go along if you're listening and you're in Lincolnshire at any point. Go along and take a look. Look at the courting couple that I mentioned. Go and see Achilles in his wonderful gown in the yellow bedroom. See how, and his beard, yes, not forgetting his beard. and see how those cuts had been made in the tapestries, and how they were previously hidden behind beds and things like this to disguise them from view, and go and appreciate John Delaval's Doddington. It's absolutely worth the visit.
Well, definitely, I'll put that on my list of places to go visit.
So, yeah, and if you're in the area, give me a shout and I'll give you a tour.
Even better, will do. Well, thank you, Leah, for coming onto this podcast. This has been really, really interesting. I'd like to talk to you more about this. Maybe after this podcast, maybe we can meet up for a cuppa or something.
That sounds perfect. Conservators love cuppas. And cake.
Oh, that's a must.
And also, Doddington, just another plug for Doddington, they have a brilliant farm shop and cafe, so
definitely worth a day out then.
Yes.
So thank you so much for coming onto this podcast. It's been really wonderful talking to you about this, and yeah, I could literally listen to you talk about this till the cows came home, because I love conservation. I love learning about it. I love learning about the different procedures and things, and because it's one of those things where you're unsung heroes in a way, because you look after these beautiful things and you do it on the sly. Like, well, sometimes some people do. Some people that have it open to the public, showing people what they're doing, so that's great as well. But yeah, I think we underestimate when we go to see these like stately homes and stuff. We underestimate the amount of time and work that's gone behind the beautiful things to just keep it there so we can see it.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And Doddington's been really great about that, in that there is visitor interpretation about the conservation process, and there's some pictures of me in a hard hat and holding a tapestry and so on the walls, that people can have a look at. But yeah, the very nature of conservation is that we try and make ourselves unobtrusive through our work, because we try not to sort of put our stamp on what we've done. It's not our place to do so. And so yes, apart from conservation in action activities and stuff like that, it is often hidden away. But I love what I do. I love this project. I love talking about it. You probably gathered that. So thank you so much for inviting me to contribute. It's been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed it.
And it's been wonderful having you on here as well. So thank you so much for agreeing to come onto this podcast and
You're very welcome.
Talk about your passion project.
Yes.
Right. So yeah, I'll sign us off now and say thank you again.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And yeah, do give me a shout if you're in links.
I will do. Thank you for this. Thank you.
No problem.
See you later. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
If you enjoyed today's episode and feel that you would also like to appear on the podcast, please do not hesitate to get in touch. You can either message me down below in the comments, or you can message me over on my Instagram, which is Book and Trowel. Please just let me know your name, your topic of interest, and I will be in touch. I hope to talk to you soon, and thank you for listening to today's episode.